not have to be here. Welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Ronald Feldstein. He is a Princeton PhD. He's probably one of the most brilliant linguists in the United States today. And he's going to, he's not only deeply talented in diachronic linguistics across the Slavic family in general, but he can give you some enlightening remarks about Jakobson's work, and he's always been very creative, which I should say in diachronic linguistics, I'm not sure that that's been the hallmark of the profession, but he's been able to bring to it creativity and interesting development that it's unfortunate that hasn't been more predominant in linguistics. So I hope you enjoy. I know that I sent you the links to some of the pieces. You may have read them before class, so that should help. And everybody should have a hard copy of the PowerPoint it's going to be showing. So let's welcome.
Thanks very much. One of my favorite subjects, Roman Jakobson. Well, we'll get into that in a moment. I'm going to be talking about a famous work by Jakobson that has here's a Xerox copy of it that I ordered many years ago when I was a graduate student, and I just became aware of it. In those days, you couldn't download anything. Nobody knew what a computer was. So you had to order it from a special Xeroxing facility. And, well, you'll take a look in a moment. It has a French title, and you'll see why. Remarque sur l'évolution phonologique du russe is the title, excuse my French. We're going to talk about the purpose of this work, what role it played, and most of all, how to read it, and some of the problems that came up with this. What this is going to show you is a way of describing the evolution of all the Slavic languages, right? So after this, you'll have a pretty good outline view of the structural reasons for the way Slavic languages appear in the world today and how it all developed. Okay, let's just take a quick look. This is what what I showed you that you could really see. This is what the publication looked like. You can see 1929 Prague. There's a lot of interesting things that can be gleaned from this little Xerox of the cover. You can see at the top, Travaux de Cercle Linguistique de Prague. This was the Prague Linguistic Circle. This was like one of the very first groups of linguists that was formed for the structural study of language. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of the other participants, but the two most famous ones were emigres from Russia. Jakobson, you could see Roman Jakobson, and also Trubetskoy, Nikolai Trubetskoy, who was like Trubetskoy's, or Jakobson's very closest collaborator. They worked together, and Trubetskoy was in Vienna, and which wasn't that far away. Jakobson was actually in Brno, Czechoslovakia at the time. It was called Czechoslovakia, not like now. Slovakia was part of it. And they both came out of Russia, something like around 1916 to 1920. You just had the Russian Revolution that took place. And why they left Russia was not exactly that they were opposed to the revolution, but they were trying to make their linguistic discoveries kind of known to the larger world. And that meant Germany, France, Central Europe. This to them was the most important thing. And so you could see it's also 1929. This was, I believe, well, it's number 2. It's one of the very first publications that came out of this series. And this series were the most distinguished publications or things that were written by members of this group. Trubetskoy's very famous book came out later, and Grundzüge der Phonologie, you may have heard of. basis, or I'm not sure, fundamentals of phonology, I guess. I'm not sure how they translate Grundzüge into English. In Russian, it's Основы фонологии. But anyway, the principles of phonology, I think is what they call it. Okay, so moving ahead, what was Jakobson's purpose in writing this? He had a very particular purpose. And as I said, they were structural linguists. They were very different from other linguists at the time. You had the older generation of linguists. Then you had Jakobson and Trubetskoy, who felt, as much as Lenin was the head of a revolution, they felt the head of a linguistic revolution. They had this kind of revolutionary spirit that they're going to bring the word of truth in linguistics to Europe, who doesn't really, where they don't exactly understand everything about it. Some people did, and you'll see in a second. So they wanted to bring the structural methods of phonological analysis to historical linguistics. That up to that time, the famous, Swiss linguist, de Saussure, felt that linguistic history was due to haphazard accidents. Even though Saussure himself, I'm sure you probably are familiar with Saussure, and he wrote the famous course of structural linguistics, where actually he didn't write it, it was his students who copied it down, and that dated from the teens. And that was sort of the first book when they published the essence of Saussure's course, I believe was given in Geneva. This was the first idea of phonemics. And what Saussure said there was that everything is mere otherness. Everything is just oppositions. The actual physical content of a phoneme, like a P or a T, isn't that important. The most important thing is, what is it opposed to? P versus B, T versus D. In other words, one thing alone didn't really have any meaning because it was not a real signal. The only way we could tell that we're saying something is in opposition to something else. Like in English, for example, pot alone wouldn't mean anything unless you have pot, not, cot, and all those others. So it's opposition that creates something. And this is what Saussure said. And Saussure analogized the phonemic system to a chess game. And he said it's sort of like when you look at a chessboard, it isn't the pieces themselves, it's all the interrelations. And that's what's important. But for some strange reason, Saussure, who was a great historical linguist and made great discoveries about Lithuanian in 1870, never really thought that historical linguistics was the same sort of system as synchronic. He thought that historical linguistics had the goal of just saying what changes to what. You just change this to this, you change this to this, and you just list all the changes. So for example, in Indo-European, if we compare all of the modern languages, like you have a D for two, in Romance languages and Slavic, right? You have dva and say dos in Spanish, but in English, you have two, the T. So you take this back and you say what the proto-language had. And the only important thing is to say Indo-European, say D or T changes to this and changes to this, and that's all they really did. They never talked about, like, what did the system look like in Indo-European? What were people actually speaking at each period? So you just had the kind of nebulous idea of A changing to B. And Jakobson called this positivism. And I remember this personally. I was lucky enough to attend a year of Jakobson's lectures when I was a graduate student in this was the 1967-68 academic year. Jakobson visited our university. He took a plane. We were in New Jersey, and he came from, you could probably tell from my accent, he came from Cambridge, where he was in MIT at the time, and he flew in every single week for a whole year, and he always talked about this. So this was not only his opinion in 1929, but even in 1967, he kept talking about how the positivists, these people that discovered Indo-European, just were interested in A changing to B, B changing to C, but they didn't look at the system at the time. So Jakobson's goal was to prove that certain systematic principles determined the split of common Slavic into different zones. And it was not just haphazard, just D changing to T, T changing to something with no meaning. It isn't just a catalog, because in fact, to this day, if you look at the traditional historical treatments of language, you'll see a big difference between them. Some of them, the vast majority in fact, will just be a list, and they'll say, okay, if you take a family like Slavic, common Slavic is supposed to be this ancestor of all the Slavic languages that never really was recorded, but we assume was the mother language. And then all the daughter languages, developed, which are Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, Croatian, and so on and so forth. And the idea that if you look at the handbooks, most of them will just say, all right, common Slavic, A changes to this, B changes to this and this, Polish does this, Russian does this, Serbian does this. And that's what Jakobson hated. His idea was talk about how each of these systems existed as a real living structure of communication. And how did it really work? Why did these things happen? He wanted to answer why all these changes took place. And that was the purpose of this book. And we're going to take a little look at what he did in there. So that's kind of like the background of what happened. He wanted to prove these certain systematic principles were behind it, and it was just not a bunch of haphazard rules that came about for no reason whatsoever. So this 1929 book that we're talking about was the first systematic linguistic history, giving systematic reasons for sound changes. And unfortunately, there aren't many of these to this day. One of the readings that I suggested that you might look at, there was a paper by Morris Holly, who wrote that in 86, this was the anniversary of something connected with Jakobson. No, it's 96. It was the 100th anniversary of Jakobson's birth when he wrote that paper. And he said that this was like the very first systematic study in historical or diachronic linguistics. But it never really caught on. And he wrote that in 86, and the thing was published in 29, and he said he was hoping that this would kind of catch on and people would start to do historical linguistics in this way. But there's very, very little of this. Very little. If you do searches online, there are some people who have written on this subject, but not really that many that have applied this to other language areas. So if anybody's a linguist here and you want to think of an interesting area, think about applying this when you find out a few of the basics. Let's take a look at what some of the background was. The work never got the recognition that some expected, right? Holly details this, but Jakobson also thought this was going to be a revolution in linguistics. And some of the stuff he did in synchronic did really become a revolution, like he invented or came up with the first idea with the name distinctive features for phonology. And this later entered mainstream linguistics. So a lot of the stuff that he did, and in fact, a lot of the stuff that he did became mainstream linguistics. But he wanted it all. I mean, he wanted to revolutionize not only synchronic, which he did, but he wanted to revolutionize historical linguistics. And he had every basis, every reason for believing that he was going to do it, but it didn't catch on as much as it could have. So now you'll learn something about it. Well, here's some of the reasons. The Russian original, he wrote it in Russian, and it was lost in World War II, and only a French translation survived. Well, you could say, well, why wasn't it published in Russian in the first place? Because this was their whole mission, why they left Russia. They didn't go to Central Europe to just publish everything in Russian. They could have stayed in Moscow and done that. The purpose of going to Central Europe was to publish things in well, not English in those days. French and German were the most common international languages at the time. And if you look at Jakobson's works of the 20s and 30s, they're almost all published in French and German. Well, he didn't write French well enough to write the book in French, so it was passed on to a translator. Then we know a lot about this. How do we know? Let me tell you where my sources are. He and Trubetskoy, who I mentioned was the other most prominent linguist of Prague School, had a correspondence. And this was published because obviously Jakobson received Trubetskoy's letters, and he eventually emigrated to the United States. And they were published. I have a copy of the book, and I'm going to quote some of these letters. So on the date when Trubetskoy first got this book, which was something in November 1929, he started giving Jakobson his comments about the book. And we're going to take a look at some of what he said. I have some of his exact quotes, and you could even see the Russian. They corresponded in their native language, Russian, and I have a few little pieces in case anybody here knows some Russian. If not, we'll skip by it very fast. Trubetskoy told Jakobson that his style was overly metaphorical and difficult because he talked about linguistic features battling with each other, dueling with each other, and conflicts. You know, at least that's what we have in the French. I don't know what the Russians said. Oh, by the way, somewhere, someplace, I found out what happened to this, that it was, maybe it was Jakobson himself who said this. I don't even remember, it's so long ago. But he buried it in the ground when he left, he was in Budino. And the story of Budino was that Hitler took over the former Czechoslovakia after the famous events where the sellout of Czechoslovakia took place, and you may have read about this in history. This was in '38, and what happened was that the Germans, during the course of the takeover of the Czech lands, Slovakia was actually made into a puppet government. But during the takeover of the Czech territory, there was some bombing in Budino, and it was buried in a hole. Well, Jakobson had to flee. Jakobson fled to Scandinavia, luckily for the world of linguistics and scholarship, and then managed to get to America after that. So he was not caught in the Nazi territory at all. Although part of the time I remember hearing in Scandinavia, he had to ski to safety. There was a period where he skied over some territory to get to a safer area, and it was eventually spirited out where he wound up in the United States and was in Columbia for a little while, then wound up in Harvard and then MIT. It's just to give you a little background on Jakobson. But anyway, so that's why we don't have the Russian, because the Russian, well, it was buried in a hole, and in Jakobson it was unrecoverable. It was either burned in the bombing or just not found. So it was never found, and that's what happened there. If anyone wants to start an archaeological expedition in Budino to find Jakobson's manuscript, who knows, maybe it'll be found someday. Well, here's a sample of Trubetskoy's comments from his letter to Jakobson. I translated these from the Russian. All of these defects are the result of haste and not enough restraint when you deal with an extremely strong torrent of ideas. Become twice as bad in translation. So the idea is Jakobson had all these brilliant ideas, and he just didn't control himself. They were not, that was the idea. And he says, Trubetskoy continues, because of all this, the book is very hard to read. To some extent, it's the Russian linguistic tradition, but your unreadability is different than Fortunatov's and Bublik's, right? Fortunatov and Bublik were other famous Russian linguists, especially historical at the time. And he says, here's a funny kind of thing here. He says, the thoughtful reader will overcome this difficulty. And if not for the stilted translation, your book would have made a great impression. But only a thoughtful reader will see and appreciate this, and that's the minority. They were very conceited. A mediocre linguist like Banic. Now, Banic was Alexander Banic, the leading Serbian linguist at the time. But of course, this was a private letter. We were never supposed to see this. This was in Jakobson's, under lock and key, and was published, in this book of letters. So only because Banic, they're all long gone, we can, say this nasty stuff about Banic, but it's actually Trubetskoy who was saying it. So, you see, this sheds light on what the Prague school was doing. They were very conceited. They said, we are, these Russian structuralists. We understand, every detail. These local people, Banic, they don't understand anything. So, a mediocre, sredny linguist is what he said, like Banic, right? Won't understand a thing. Ничего не поймет in Russian, right? By the way, with a little effort, you could have made it comprehensible even for every mediocre linguist. Of course, you'll never change. That's what, and then Jakobson responded to this. Well, this was the original, right? This is what Trubetskoy actually said, right? See if about Banic, right? Средний читатель лингвист вроде Банича просто ничего не поймет, right? That's, okay, so anyway, this is what it looks like. You can actually get, this is a book of Trubetskoy's letters to Jakobson. But then, mostly we don't have Jakobson's replies, because Trubetskoy died and actually had a heart attack around the time of the Nazi occupation, so his stuff was lost. But Jakobson actually gives the answer to this. Jakobson saved his answer, and I have that. So you can see now what Jakobson's reply was to this. And he says, unfortunately, I have to agree with what you say about my written style. True, the translation takes a lot away from the book. The original is much more succinct, but my inability to develop a thought remains. Only, it's not the result of haste. On the contrary, the more I work on something, the more attention it gets. If I rework a chapter, I inadvertently fill it with more and more ideas that come into my mind. If you wish, now here's a joke. This is Jakobson's joke. If you wish, it's the Ushakov school. Now, Ushakov was a famous Russian linguist. Not the linguist, Dmitry Ushakov, but the icon painter, Simon Ushakov. The idea is he painted these icons with these tiny little figures all over the place. So he said it's the Ushakov school, but not the linguist Ushakov, the icon painter Ushakov. The sense of how one section relates to the whole work gets lost. However harmful this is to my work, maybe there's something like this Bosch, you know, with all these, with Bosch, with all these little tiny figures in it. But however harmful this is to my work, it's extremely hard to get rid of it, psychologically, except by writing short articles on single subjects. Well, anyway, that's the matter. That's why it's hard to read. Jakobson just had this kind of thing. And like one of his most famous classics is like an 8-page article in Russian conjugation. And it's supposedly extremely hard to read. When I first went on a summer program to Russia, there was a recent PhD, and we were a little cocky. We thought we knew Russian very well. And he said, you think you know Russian? Read this in English and see if you can understand it. And he gave us Jakobson's Russian conjugation. And we said, wow, we were not really sure what this one means. And so Jakobson has been famous for this. And I since my teenage years, when I went on that trip, I know that, you know, Jakobson was famous for this kind of unreadability. And that was a short article. You take an entire book that he wrote, and it even got worse. So this is a famous kind of thing in the field, but the ideas are interesting, and it's a challenge. One reason that, like, when these are my notes, I unearthed these. This was like when I was a graduate student. I took this book, and it was supposed to be so hard that as a challenge, I went through everywhere, page by page, and I made notes. See, you can see this is an old notebook. It's only 59 cents, right? So you can see how long ago that was. But so this was a challenge for me all the time, and even now, I enjoy the idea of going through it. So let's take a look at what Jakobson is doing. Now that you have the background. Jakobson's difficult metaphors, these conflicts and struggles and all this, they are ways of expressing relative chronology. In other words, his idea is that it's not enough to just say that, you know, A becomes B. That there's a difference. If B becomes A, it's different than A becoming B. In other words, because you have these changes going across the linguistic territory. And let's say you have one change moving across the territory, say to change something in the language. Then another change coming after that. You have two possible changes. Well, a lot of things can happen, as we'll see later on maps. The first change can go at a faster rate of speed, can skip ahead. And then in one territory, you're going to have change number 1 and then change number 2. But then if change number 2 has a faster rate of speed going across, you're going to get change number 2, then number 1. So you're going to get different rule orderings for these changes that take place. And that's where you get conflicts, depending on the order of application. We'll see that in more detail. So almost everything in this book hinges on whether certain things occur before or after a particular rule. And the rule in question, which is the most important rule for this whole book, is the loss of final short vowels in Slavic languages. First final, eventually it was a whole bunch of short vowels, but these were short highs that are known by their Slavic name for the Slavic letter, yer. Yer is the name of the letter. So I'm not sure if you ever heard of this before, but this is one of the most common subjects in Slavic linguistics, the loss of the yers, which is really the loss of final short vowels. Now, a lot of times this happens in other languages too, and we'll talk about that. But that's what happens. Now, sometimes another sound change will come before the loss of the yers. Sometimes it'll happen after. And that's what everything's going to hinge on, whether something took place before the loss of the yers or the final short vowels. Just final high, I should say not just short vowels, but high shorts, like E and U. They're really short E and short U. I should have said final high short vowels. But anyway, that's what I have in mind. So one ordering would mean the absence of conflict and certain types of changes, but the opposite ordering means that you get a so-called conflict, that the system can't really tolerate it, and changes to take place. Now, just in a conversation before class with your professor, I was talking about something that just occurred to me, that in modern Polish, there's a type of conflict going on, and because it so happens that standard Polish happens to have a group of features, has a large consonant system, but has nasal vowels. And no dialect has that, but it was kind of artificially put in because it's a compromise between Eastern Polish and Western Polish. See, in Western Polish, you don't get nasal vowels, but you get, or rather, you get nasal vowels and a smaller consonant system. But in Eastern Polish, you tend to get nasal vowels and a bigger you get a small consonant system and you get nasal vowels. So it's the opposite in different territories. But in the literary standard language, you have a big consonant system plus nasal vowels. So what happens? Polish speakers tend to drop nasals in all kinds of ways. When a nasal occurs finally, like, instead of ja piszę, the normal thing to say is ja piszę. And so on and so forth. And a lot of times, instead of something like a pure nasal, which would be song, they say song, or something like that. And so nasals are, in other words, that's what a conflict is. A conflict is where a language, for some reason, has features in it that it inherited that are not normal to the usual amount of load, of load in a language, informational load in the language. So speakers just try to get rid of some features, and that's what all this is about. Okay, what was Jakobson's method? Well, Jakobson's method was, he first laid out some general linguistic principles, he believed, that no language would do certain things. And there have been many, many arguments about whether it's all languages or some languages, but at the very least, these principles mean all Slavic languages and most languages in general. Let's agree on that. Whether they're totally universal or not has been a subject of debate for many linguists. We'll get into some of those details at this time. So he wanted to lay out some general principles, several phonological features, which could not co-occur in the same system, or had to co-occur. Some have to go together, some never could go together. And so Jakobson thought these were universals, or near universals, and applied to almost all world languages, not just Slavic. Each group of features produced a unique combination of features in the various Slavic zones. So before looking at these linguistic rules, we'll get into these basic, there's something like 3, so it's not like 49, you don't have to deal that much for free. They deal with certain phonological oppositions that can occur. But I don't know how familiar you are with all the Slavic areas, so I'll give you a brief review of the Slavic map. Hopefully this map will work. And just to show you what we're dealing with. There are 3 main branches of Slavic languages. And so we have South Slavic, which runs from Slovene in the west all the way to Bulgaria on the Black Sea coast. And Jakobson's names for these languages are a little bit different than what we use now. He mainly used the term Serbian for what sometimes is called Serbo-Croatian. Nowadays it's mostly called Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and it's because it's essentially the same or similar language, and it was considered the same language for Jakobson. But he called it Serbian maybe because Russia and Serbia had the closest ties, and it's this whole territory that he refers to as Serbian. And he put it together with Slovene because it's very similar to Slovene in many ways, and he called it Serbo-Slovene a lot of the time. And then you have Macedonian didn't even exist as a standard language at the time, so he only talks about West Bulgarian and East Bulgarian. West Bulgarian is more or less part of the Macedonian territory with a piece of West Bulgaria, and then you have East Bulgarian is over here. So for him, those are very important separate territories. We have the Serbo-Slovene, and West Bulgarian is here, East Bulgarian is here, and then West Slavic is this big piece, including Polish, Czech, and Slovak, and also there's a little area of a tiny thing, like less than 100,000 speakers in Germany, called Sorbian. And mostly those are older generation people, and well, virtually everybody in the Sorbian territory is a bilingual speaking German. Anyway, that's West Slavic. And then we have East Slavic, which includes Ukraine, or Ukrainian in language terms. This territory, which nowadays is called Belarusian because of the name Belarus. When I was younger, it used to be called Belarusian. It's the same thing. I might slip and call it Belarusian or Belarusian, either one. And then Russian, right? Of course, the territory is very large. But the original Russian-speaking territory is not that large because a lot of this was conquered territory farther east, and the original Russian-speaking area is more or less equivalent to the other ones just around here. So anyway, that's the map. You have East Slavic, West Slavic, and South Slavic, but South Slavic is really very heavily split in two zones. The reason it's split is that they feel that these Slavs really were East Slavs that came down and settled this. This was not original Slavic territory, but the western half of South Slavic were the migrants from here that came down and settled this half. So that's the reason South Slavic really is kind of split right over here. So that's what the map looks like. Okay. And this is in terms of the language features, right? We don't really have time to get. I did this already on the map. The way I forgot I had this coming. Here you have Sorbian, right? You can see West Slavic with the different languages. Well, Polish is part of the Lakhitic branch. So sometimes it's referred to as Lakhitic, and you have Polish, and also Kashubian, but we're not going to have time to really talk about that very much. Czech and Slovak are in a single branch, then you have the Czech and Slovak separated out, and then East Slavic with Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian, and so on. For South Slavic, you can see the Macedonian Bulgarian group over here. This is the Eastern group. And in this group, they call it Serbo-Croatian. They're not quite sure. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Serbo-Croatian, with Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, any of those names can serve, and then Slovene together with that. Okay? So we'll move on from there. Now let's take a look. As I mentioned before, the trigger for all these changes, in other words, you could say things would have pretty much stayed the same, and we wouldn't have much to talk about if it weren't for this change in all Slavic zones, the loss of weak years, which are these short, high vowels, front and back, that are written this way. That's the way they're written in Slavic, but you could write them as a short I and a short U, and it's not too far from the truth. And here some examples would be this. The E, say dani, and danu would be different. And if we take the modern Russian meanings, one is a tax, and one means given. So they're different words. You don't have to really worry about what the meaning is, but they are different words. And this thing, dropping these vowels, it started in the southwest of Slavic. Now, how do we know that? From manuscripts going back to this original period, we can tell that it started, and the assumption is that maybe it was around the year 1000, roughly, that it started in the southwest of Slavic, and it moved toward the northwest and the east, the loss of these years. Now, prior to this, consonants before front vowels became palatalized, symbolized by this ny. That would be ny. So you see what happens. The essential point to get is this. If you take this thing that was a minimal pair, originally it had a vowel that differentiated these things. So when it had a vowel, you had the allophonic or automatic palatalization plus the front vowel, and then the absence of palatalization plus the back vowel. So notice, originally they would have sounded in Common Slavic like dani and danu, something like that. But then when the vowel got lost, it's what we have in modern Russian. The N, palatalized and unpalatalized, is the whole difference. Listen, dan, dan. And not every language has that. And I remember, Jakobson always used, when he gave his lectures, he always used to give this example with krov and krosh. And where you said many people in many languages never could really hear this difference because it's something that some languages have, and this is very particular to certain Slavic languages for the eastern side of Slavic. So, for example, in the western part, Serbian, Croatian, Slovene, and so forth, they lost all that, and that's part of the whole story. But this is what could have happened. that according to Common Slavic, you had this potential for this to happen. And let's just say that this opposition was a type of tonality or frequency in consonants. Now, there's another type of tonality that can occur in vowels, in tonal languages. You can have high pitch and low pitch. But this type of thing, dang versus dang, takes advantage of tonality for consonants. And that's what made it different. So this right away you can see, we're going to see this again, but right away this is the essential conflict that happened, that if you had this opposition, what do you do with your tone? Because the language had tone. It also had a rising ah versus ah. In other words, it had a rising and falling ah. So this made a mess in the language, that if you drop these years, if the years are there, there's no opposition, because then the vowel carries the phonemic weight, you see? But once you lose the vowel, all the phonemic opposition, the only thing differentiating these two words is the hard end, and we call this also hard and soft, right? The palatalized is the soft end and the hard end. So this is really where the problem is going to come about. If the vowels, the air vowels, were to drop, a new kind of palatalized phonemic opposition would come about. And this is characteristic of Russian and some other Slavic languages, but as I said, not the Southwest, Slovene, Serbian, and Croatian, and several others. And Jakobson's principles address this. Now, most of the principles address how vowel accents interface with the possibility of these new palatalized consonants. So what happens if you have a rule coming around that says drop your years and develop new palatalized consonants, but what do you do with that tonal accent of your ahs and e's that used to have a high tone and a low tone? In Common Slavic, the first syllable used to be able to have two different kind of accented types, rising and falling. Tone, pitch and tone I'm using more or less interchangeably, so they're called pitch or tone. Actually, what they're called here, and I change it in all my translations, Jakobson called them musical correlations, but I call them pitch or tone. And so that's why this book is a little hard. The way it was translated, I'm not quite sure what he had in Russian, but in French it's corrélation musicale, something like that. But anyway, I wouldn't worry about it. It all means the same thing. So the first syllable used to be able to have a difference between rising and falling. Vowels could be long or short, but had to be long for the rising-falling opposition, according to Jakobson's theory. Now this is also important for Jakobson. Jakobson broke long vowels into two separate units they call moras, each with one mora and a second mora. And his idea was that rising tone was equivalent to accent on the second one, but only inside a syllable. So that if you had two syllables with shorts, it was just accent without tone. But if you had a long sequence of two moras, that if you accented the first one, it was a low tone, because it was accented then went down. If you accented the second one, it was rising. So that's why where you start to get the theories that Jakobson had. So you can see right away that in order to have tone, you had to have long vowels, according to Jakobson. You had to have long and short. You could have long and short without tone, but if you had tone, you had to have long. Why? Because he felt that tone itself. Now this wasn't not original with Jakobson. Actually, Trubetskoy was the person who first put this across. But as I said, they were collaborators and worked on projects together all the time. So this was originally Trubetskoy's idea, but Jakobson, embraced it completely. Falling tone was equal to accent on the first mora, right? And rising was accent on the second mora. Accents on other syllables, when you had a tonal system, supposedly were shown by a rise. But if you didn't have a tonal system, in other words, if you didn't have two moras and tone in one syllable, then any old accent was by loudness. So you could say in English, how do we tell the difference between words like present and present? Since we don't have a tonal language, the thinking is it's loudness, or Russian, the same story. Russian doesn't have a tonal system, so the idea is that regular accents are shown by just louder voice. There's present, these accents and syllables louder, not necessarily higher in tone. It might have higher tone, but that's not the distinctive feature. It's just a feature that could be suspended in certain circumstances. That is the idea there. But the idea is in Common Slavic, beside having pitch on a single accent, you could have a long word where you had one syllable different than another, And in that particular case, it would be high pitch that would set the accent off instead of loudness. Now, by the way, in various Asian languages like Chinese, you have a different kind of pitch. So this, I want to just make clear, this is a multi-syllable tone. This is a situation which Jakobson feels is analogous to Japanese, but not Chinese. Chinese, you can have a monosyllable. In Slavic, you never would have a monosyllable with these tonal differences, especially a short one. You must have at least a long vowel. And so this does not necessarily parallel what you get in monosyllabic tonal languages. This is a particular type of, in modern Europe, you get this in many dialects of Serbo-Croatian, Slovene, Lithuanian has it, some Scandinavian languages have it. But anyway, that's not the same thing necessarily as Asian. We're not going to speak about the Chinese type of tone. Okay, so let's move on from there. So here are the rules. These are, what I did was tried my best to distill these out of Jakobson's book. He doesn't really, the thing is, they're not set off in such a clear way, and they're a little hard to read, but this is my attempt to make them a little bit easier to show you. And if you don't know these rules, you can't really understand what Jakobson is saying about these isoglosses and all the conflict. The conflicts don't make any sense unless you understand these principles, which is one reason it's a hard book to read. So let's see if we could find out what these rules are. So the first one kind of says the same thing that we just went over. Vowel tone requires quantity, right? Because you have to, according to Jakobson, you have to have the two mores in order to have a high pitch set off from a low pitch, and implies that stressed versus unstressed is based on high pitch rather than loudness, right? That's just what kind of recapitulates what I just said. Number two is that phonemic dynamic stress, that's the regular kind of stress we have in English, just loudness stress. There's a lot of names. In this book, it's called intensity stress. Intensity stress, or the force feature, sometimes it's called. Just non-tonal accent. That what we have in English and Russian. That type of stress and vowel quantity are mutually exclusive. They don't both occur. And what's the reason? That one, when I first read it, was a little harder to understand. Why would it be that if you don't combine stress with the regular with quantity, right? Why do the two not go together? Well, the thing is that if you have a free stress system and you have two mores, which would be implied by quantity, you probably are going to want to be able to have, tone, because you'd want to stress the second more or the first more. So it wouldn't make sense to have a free stress where stress was not restricted, but yet have two mores together and not have the ability to stress a free stress on one or the other. So for that reason, that you usually don't get long and short vowels in a system that has quantity. That is long and short vowels. If you have long and short vowels, you're not going to have free stress. Usually you'll have fixed stress. Now, this was controversial because there are languages that violate this, and Ivic, the famous Serbian linguist, pointed out that in Montenegro there are a couple dialects near the Albanian border that have long and short vowels without tone. They got rid of tone. But it's kind of transitory because they were in the process of changing from tonal system to a non-tonal system. And it's only a tiny, tiny exception. And Jakobson later modified his statement to just say the vast majority of the Slavic languages follow this rule. And even at the time this was written, there's a footnote where Jakobson said that the famous Russian linguist Polivanov pointed out that a Japanese dialect that he knew violated something like this. So anyway, don't worry about whether one little dialect violates it. According to Jakobson, at least for the purposes of reading this book, a language can't have free stress across syllables and also have long and shorts, right? According to this, actually, you'd say, where did Jakobson ever get these things? How did he find out? That's the secret. What he did was he actually started out inductively by looking at what the Slavic languages are doing. So you see, for example, Czech and Slovak have fixed stress only on the first syllable. Old Polish had long and short, and along with quantity, right? But no tone. So he just observed, very carefully observed what every single Slavic language is doing. Then he went back and he wrote rules to apply to all those. And then he sort of kind of pretended in a way that these were principles that were like set down before he even looked at the Slavic languages. But in any case, it's a great treatment of Slavic and a great discovery. So it was done inductively rather than deductively. Rule number 3 is if a moiraic tonal opposition inside a syllable is absent, that is, if you don't have moras, then stressed and unstressed must be based on loudness, obviously, because you can't get pitch because you don't have the 2 moras involved. So if you don't have moras, you never are going to get a phonemic pitch. And number 4 deals with palatalization. This is what I briefly mentioned before. Consonant palatalization was basically consonantal tone. And you can't mix consonantal tone with vocalic tone. In other words, if you have consonantal palatalization and vocalic tone are mutually exclusive, a language can't have both consonantal and vocalic tone. And this relates to Yerfol, because Yerfol in the usual development would have produced consonantal tone. So that if the language had vocalic tone already, it had to either get rid of one or do something unusual that we'll take a look at. If a language had tone to start with, and then consonantal palatalization developed at the moment of Yerfol, it was possible for the language to have conflicting features that could not combine. So something had to be lost so they could lose features. Conflicting would mean 2 features that don't normally go together were temporarily shoved together, and the language had to just deal with it, right? Like a lot of life situations are like that. Well, that would mean if a language had consonant palatalization that developed because of losing ears and still had tone, then you had this kind of conflict that they had to lose one, and sometimes they lost both of them because it was such a confusing situation. A little bit like, say, some modern Polish dialects dealing with nasal vowels competing with very big consonantal systems. They don't, and I have a feeling, my own, what I just sort of thought about, was that there may be these types of features all over the place in lots of different languages. And many times, in fact, Jakobson's theory would be that any time something changes, there's some kind of conflict going on, whether we realize it or not. But it's the linguist's job. This may be like the most important lesson to learn out of this, not the specifics of Slavic, but that language changes often are due to various conflicts of things that don't normally occur together. And I think this is really a lot of the basis of optimality theory, this recent theory of linguistics, because the idea is that what's an optimal system? An optimal system is a system that follows all of Jakobson's rules, that works the way it should. A non-optimal system is a system, in a way, in conflict, that really wants to change in one way or the other. So this has a really good lesson for linguistics in general. So conflicting features meant that the language has to get rid of one or the other of the features that are in conflict. A Slavic language could either avoid all conflicts by changing its system prior to Yerfol, or deal with a set of conflicts. Now, the idea is that sometimes, according to Jakobson, a language anticipated this, managed to solve it by getting rid of one of the potentially conflicting features before the conflict even developed. Now, so his theory of Slovene and Serbo-Croatian were that they developed pitch, right? They continued having pitch. They never developed any evidence whatsoever of consonant palatalization. So what do you think his theory was? That they lost consonant palatalization before years even got lost. They lost, even when you had dan y and dan n, even with the vowel there, they lost the palatalization before front vowels. Because Russian, for example, has automatic consonant palatalization before every front vowel, even today, except for a few foreign words. Serbo-Croatian and South Slavic in general, mostly Slovene and Serbo-Croatian, don't have that. They don't have automatic palatalization. And Jakobson's theory is that that happened right before Yerfol. So they never had a conflict. They got rid of the potential for that. So what happens? Dan and dan become the same. So in Serbo-Croatian, the 2 words dan would be equal, exactly equal. There's no difference between them, and they lose that opposition. But as a consequence, they can keep the tonal or pitch opposition. So that's the way that happened. And you could say, how did they know? How would they have known? Well, that goes back to how these features change. Jakobson had a theory that lets us know how they would have known in advance. This always bothered me when I first read about it. How would they have known in advance to change this? Well, because how does a new feature come about? According to Jakobson's theory, the loss of years started out as a younger person's development. As anything new in language, you could say older people, learn to speak the way they speak, and they don't change their speech anymore. Younger people, right, learn speech in a way that allows for some kinds of changes to take place, because they don't learn it exactly perfectly. They introduce changes. The new generation starts to do things a little bit differently. They think it's a younger person's speech or style. Like usually when you hear people speak, you could, not only vocabulary, you could tell that it's an older person's speech pattern sometimes. And that's Jakobson's idea. And then little by little, so then the older people start to really use some of these features, but not all of them. And of course, then the generation changes, the younger people get older, and it becomes standard, right? So the idea is, so that's how they would know that the older people would have kind of gotten a little hint of what's coming, because in the younger person's speech, you'd start to have these dropping of years. But yet the younger people would realize that the older people have a pitch opposition, so rather than just drop the years, the younger people would have started to lose palatalization as well. So why? Because that would blend in better with the system. But it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it works real smoothly, and sometimes you get a conflict and it doesn't. So anyway, Jakobson named two types of conflict, and this is where this term conflict comes about. Conflict A occurred if the consonant and vocalic tone clashed in the same system. That is, if they didn't do what I just told you that Serbo-Croatian and Slovene did. Let's say they didn't eliminate the consonant palatalization, and they still had tone. Then you'd have these clashing things, two features that don't go together, and they'd have what's called a conflict. And very often when you got the conflict, you'd lose both features, because they just couldn't tolerate either one. And that's what happened in Czech and Slovak, by the way. They don't have tone, and they don't have palatalization. They lost both. But then, as it moved farther and got to Polish and Russian territory, then this was already anticipated, and they lost, in fact, tone first. And then they were able to keep palatalization with no problem whatsoever. So it's this alternation between what you lose. So it's all relative chronology. Is year fall first? Is the loss of palatalization first? Is the loss of tone first? Or if not, do you have a conflict or not, right? So you have conflict A, which is the conflict between the great battle between consonant tone and vocalic tone. That's conflict A. In this case, the vowel tone was lost, but vowel quantity was then paired with non-tonal accent. So then you get, notice what would happen. If you have conflict A and you lose tone, then you wind up with another conflict based on another principle of Jakobson. Because if you lose tone, rising and falling become identical, and you wind up with what? What kind of accent? The regular, plain, non-tonal accent or loudness accent. But then that can't combine with long and short, long and short quantity. So then that's called conflict B. Conflict B comes out of conflict A. It's that you lose your tonal accent and you have a stress accent, but then you have to get rid of that. Now, if you just compare, say, Polish and Russian, you can see, oh, I think I forgot to turn my phone off. I hope it doesn't ring, but anyway. If you have say, compare Russian and Polish, right, with these conflicts, or Czech, Russian, and Polish, notice what happens, that in Old Polish and Czech and Slovak, you had quantity, but the accent became fixed. That's why all over West Slavic, the accent is in a particular place. That you have first syllable accent in Czech and Slovak, because it means, wait, just 1 second, we'll get to what it means. So in Polish, you have next to last, right, penultimate accent on the next to last syllable. But in Russian, it's the opposite, East Slavic in general. You have no quantity, no long and short syllables, but the accent is free to be on any syllable. So that's where Jakobson got this. Now notice, losing stress accent doesn't mean that you totally lose it. It just means you lose it phonemically. And that's a really essential point. It's just like when I first read this, wait a minute, I'm wondering about Polish. Polish has an accent. You could still, you can't say Polska, you have to say Polska, right? Say byłem w Polsce, right? You have to have, byłem, you can't say byłem. You still have an accent, but it's not phonemic. It means every word, this accent is on the next to the last syllable instead of being like on the last syllable. So it just means what Jakobson means. That's also another way this book could be misunderstood. When Jakobson says loss of tone, there's still tones. I mean, if you measure the vowel in Russian or Polish, it still has some frequency to it. It doesn't mean it's absent tone. It just means it's not used phonemically. You can't use it to differentiate between two words. So every time Jakobson speaks about loss of features, he means the loss of phonemic features. Right, I think we better move along. So the major zones change their systems either before or after Yerfol, and Jakobson's theory of phonological conflicts can be treated as differences, as we said, of relative chronology. Now, as far as the isoglosses are concerned, you can analogize it to a race, because you have these various isoglosses, and I'd like to show this on a little chart, if we still have time. There's kind of a race where the person in the lead, or the isogloss, just means, in other words, a map of something like losing palatalization, and how that works. I have a map of this. Why don't I skip forward to show you? So this is my map, not in Jakobson's book, of what I think Jakobson meant. And so, for example, you have, say, two isoglosses. Say this one is Yerlos, right? Say in this territory. So you have Yerlos, which is going this way, and say loss of palatalized consonants. That, oh, I forgot, the C got lost, but it's not consonants, it's consonants. I have somehow lost my C. I don't know how that happened. Well, something like Yerlos. So anyway, you have this loss of palatalized consonants moving this way, and assume this is the South, this is a Slovene, Serbian, or Croatian, or something like that. Well, they lose this first, and then no conflict, because by the time the Yerfol comes, they don't have to worry about instituting consonant tonality. But then let's say this has, we add some gasoline over here, and this gets a little speed, right? And we speed this up, and say we push it. I can't do this on a steady map, but I can just explain it. Say this one skips ahead, right? Goes a little faster for reasons we don't know. These things move at their own rate of speed. And say by the time you get up there to Czech, which I can't reach, right? You have Czech way up there. Let's say this is first, and Yerfol is first. Then you're going to have consonant palatalization, and you're not going to lose palatalized consonants right. Then you're going to get a conflict. So you see, the issue of whether you get a conflict is the rate of speed of two isoglosses. So you have two isoglosses. This is like a calculus of isoglosses. So this is really what Jakobson's book is about. And you could say it's a hard book in a way, but it's understandable. It's hard, but you can really understand it if you just get into it. So it's the rate of speed of isoglosses going across the whole territory. And what I have here is I have a diagram that I made which shows every territory and the different isoglosses. And of course, this is more like a semester course than a one-hour lecture. And I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to go into every detail here. But maybe we'll just wind up with this and say that you do know the basis of these things. The most important things are the conflicts, conflict A, conflict B. And every zone had its own particular rules. And we can say one extreme is Russian, where they lost pitch in advance. And they instituted consonant palatalization with no problem whatsoever. And then they lost quantity and have no conflict and a very, very neat system. And then you have the opposite extreme is Serbo-Croatian and Slovene, where they lost palatalization in the beginning. And then instituted or continued to have tone, and also no conflict. Everything in the middle has, well, Polish is supposedly similar to Russian, but the other ones that are kind of in the middle, Czech, Slovak, West Bulgarian, East Bulgarian, have some kind of combination where there was some conflict involved, at least a little. There's less of a conflict in East Bulgarian, but a big conflict here. And what did the big conflict mean? In West Bulgarian and Czech and Slovak, you lost both. You lost consonant palatalization and tone. See, the whole point is everywhere else except for here, you kept at least one. So here you kept tone but lost palatalization. Here you have palatalization that is Polish, East Bulgarian, East Slavic, you have palatalization, at least to some extent, and loss of tone. But here you lost both of them because the conflict was bigger. So this is the way Jakobson looked at it. You have your battle ready here, you have your battle ready here, you're prepared here, you're prepared here. But these four dialects here in the middle, they lost everything because they had this confrontation, you know, this clash of consonant palatalization, consonant tonality, vocalic tonality, and the result of this great clash was that both of these were lost in this territory. So that's the essence of Jakobson's theory of diachronic linguistics.